Hi guys, so today we're looking at revising democracy. We're going to do this in 3 parts. So part 1 is this session, which is essentially looking at what is democracy, the theory behind democracy, and how democratic is the UK. The next part will be about pressure groups and their impact on democracy. And then the last final part will be about democracy and human rights. What I want to start thinking about then is if we're looking at the sort of theory behind democracy today and assessing democracy in general, what about in our school? How democratic is the convent? So I think the obvious thing that springs to mind is that it's quite democratic in the sense that we have a school parliament, and if we're assessing the successes and failures of the school parliament, it's been pretty successful considering the fact that it's extremely representative. 72 MPs across the entire school, which means that there is a range of ages being heard, so there's pluralism in terms of the age demographic. Also, the nature of students at Parliament, they're not all the same type of well-behaved student, but there is a mix of well-behaved students, more naughty students, and those sorts of things. So in terms of representation, I feel like it's quite democratic there. In terms of accountability, Prime Minister's questions every half term. However, the crucial thing about democracy is it's not about being a tokenistic democracy, and how much power does the school parliament actually have in creating change at the convent of Jesus and Mary. So the reason why I want you to think about that is I want you to think about the definition of democracy carefully. Democracy is a society where people have real influence over the political decisions that will affect them and fulfills a democratic criteria. And I think that's the crucial thing to consider. Do we at the convent actually have real decisions over the things that are affecting us in the school? We may have influence, I guess, but not real influence in the sense that it's optional whether or not the school listens to us. What is the origins of democracy? So democracy originates from ancient Greece with the Athenian model of democracy, and it started off initially as a direct democracy where you had all free citizens being able to make important decisions and being part of the lawmaking process. So you would essentially meet up in an assembly, and in that assembly you would debate and discuss issues, and then you would be able to vote on it afterwards, and after you voted on it, that decision would become law, essentially. So, crucially, it's to do partially with population size. In terms of free citizens, that's a very key word, because free citizens were effectively male non-slaves. So if you were a woman and if you were a slave, which was a sizable part of the populations, you were not considered to be a citizen. Therefore, the assembly was only about 30,000 people, which is still quite a lot, but only about 3,000 citizens would attend in that. So it was actually quite possible to have a decision-making body in that sense because the numbers were so low. So because it was to do with the way it was sectioned off, like right now we have a country, which is obviously quite big. In the ancient Greece system, you had city-states, so the populations were smaller. So obviously this isn't really a viable option in the UK today because the population size is just too huge. So we do still use it today in society, and we exercise a form of direct democracy through referenda. So importantly, the difference is though, direct democracy does not exist today. No country in the entire world uses the form of direct democracy. However, we use elements of it whenever we have referenda. So it's an addition to representative democracy. It does not exist on its own, and I think that's an important differentiation to make. So what are the advantages and disadvantages to direct democracy? In terms of advantages, it's a pure form of democracy. People's voices are clearly heard, obviously only some people's, but anyway, so it makes it a pure form of democracy. It is the purest form in the sense that people can express their views, people can debate, and then the people make a decision. It also avoids deadlock and delay because you have that absolute choice. So people have chosen something and then you have to actually implement it. Although I think we can see the fact that Brexit is an element of direct democracy in the sense that the people voted for it, that's only created more deadlock and delay. So I don't think that's always the case. Although you could argue that when you mix direct and representative democracy, then you can still have deadlock and delay, like with Brexit. And it's also considered to be legitimate, and it's legitimate through people power. This idea, it is the will of the people, which we're hearing a lot when we're talking about Brexit, because it represents what the people felt. It's straightforward, people want this, the people want that. There are obviously, even within these advantages, there's several disadvantages within that. I think one of the biggest things you can see here is it's a little bit simplistic, isn't it? So when we're thinking about direct democracy in terms of when we use a form of it in referenda, it's far too simplistic to boil an issue down to yes or no. There are a lot of clauses within that, there's a lot of complications within that. And what this ends up doing is it leads to tyranny of the majority. You have the minorities being held at the will of the majority. It's too simplistic in that sense. So minority rights are completely washed out when you have direct democracy. You also have individuals being swayed by short-term emotional appeals. What this means is charismatic individuals and politicians can convince the people of what they think they want, which isn't necessarily the best thing. They also simplify issues so that people are making decisions based on emotions rather than practicality and rationality. We can see that in terms of what's happened with Brexit, talking about things like sovereignty and how that's more important than our rights. But actually, it's just so simplistic to look at it in terms of that. How much does the average Joe or Jane really actually care about sovereignty? How much does that actually impact their lives? It's just an emotional appeal that's been made by charismatic people such as Farage and Johnson. Politics is too complex. And you have this idea of the mass man and how the mass man is too busy with basic things of survival to actually invest times in understanding, that they're too spoilt by industrialization to appreciate the finer things in politics. People just do not have the time to understand politics. And because of that, we give some of our power to representative individuals who can actually spend that time and making those decisions for us. In terms of direct democracy, politics is too big now. It is too complex. People cannot spend their time investing in understanding it whilst doing the other crucial things to making society function. Therefore, it's better to leave it to some people who can spend that time understanding it in order to make the decisions for us. We obviously have a representative democracy in the UK. So, what is representative democracy? This is where elected representatives make political decisions on the people's behalf. This is a system that's most commonly used in terms of political system, and it is used in the UK. The way that this works then is there's different elements of it. One of those elements is party representation. In order to simplify the system as much as possible, we vote for our MPs, but those MPs stand in a faction in a political party and they run on a manifesto and they make promises about what they will do if they are elected, and when they are elected they implement that manifesto as they have the mandate in order to do that. So when they're running for that, people are given a choice about who they want to vote for and they could read the policies in the manifesto. So it's a way to get people's voices and interests and concerns heard. You also have constituency representation, which is about people are able to go and speak to their MP and say, we have issues with this. They can write letters to them, they can email them, they can visit them in person in their surgery hours. And what the MP will do then is redress grievances. So they'll listen to the views, they can write to the Prime Minister to basically give air to those views. They can talk about it in Prime Minister's questions, or the MP can actually often do something about it for them as well. But in terms of our politics, in terms of representative democracy, we obviously have three different views about the way it works. So is it that the MP should be a person who is just a mouthpiece of the party and they should just toe the party line? Should they do exactly what their constituency wants them to do? Or should they have the Burkean or trustee view? In representative democracy, they're expected to use their expertise to make the best decision for the national interest. The other part is that in a representative democracy, our elected representatives are accountable. So there's checks and balances on them. You can now recall your MP. You have a choice in whether or not to keep or get rid of them every 5 years in an election as well. So they're held accountable to the public. There is social representation reflecting the country's demographics. So you will have 50% women if the population is 50% women, and so forth. So then that will help to make the population more representative by having the equal amount of voices heard across the country. You have causal representation as well, so representing a cause, an ideal or principle, so functional too. Having a pressure group, being able to have a voice, so it's not just elective MPs having a voice, but there's other assets of UK society which represents the people. And essentially the party, when they become elected, have an electoral mandate, the authority of the electorate to carry out its manifesto commitments as well. What are the pros and cons of representative democracy? What are the advantages and disadvantages? In terms of advantages then, you have this idea that it's the rule of experts or expertise. Because we obviously don't have time to invest in politics, you have people who are dedicating their lives to understanding politics and current affairs and being able to represent us in our best interests on our behalf, whilst we can continue doing the other crucial elements to make society function. And I think with the coronavirus outbreak, we can really see what actually is important to making society function. Yeah, politicians are important, so are doctors, and so are nurses, but also the other things we call we have something called key workers, so teachers, doctors, nurses, but actually everyone's a key worker, surely, because we all make society function in our own way. So we have the shopkeepers, you have supermarket workers and so forth. And I think it just proves that it's not that politics isn't important, it's just that we should all have specialities in different areas in society. Some of us should just be shop workers and worry about fulfilling that job effectively. Some of us should just be teachers and fulfilling that job effectively. Some of us should just be politicians and so forth. Representatives can be more rational and less emotively attached to issues because obviously they're further away from them, so they can often make the best choice for people. They're also democratically accountable. If we don't like what an elected politician is doing, we can remove them easily enough. And also it allows for multiple voices to be heard, so it's a counter to tyranny of the majority, because an elected representative has to think about not just their constituency actually, but the people as a whole, and will making a decision impact negatively on other people in the country, and thus have to make decisions for that. It's also obviously just practical. It's a lot more manageable for large populations. So direct democracy doesn't exist because there's too many of us, so representative democracy is a way to resolve that. So do we end up having an elective dictatorship through representative democracy where we just choose our dictators every 5 years? So this idea is quite positive, I think, in terms of representatives, that they're experts, they're more rational, they can care about more people in the population. Or is it actually that they just care about party politics? Are they just in it to be careerists? They're in it for their next promotion, and the best way to get promoted is to toe the party line. Do they end up representing what their party cares more than they represent about what is good for the country? They also don't always represent the views of the population. Do they care about what's good for the population? Are they just governed by ideology as well, rather than what is good for people? So, for example, you saw with Margaret Thatcher, she was heavily influenced by Hayek, and he talked about the fact that there is no such thing as social good. It's actually about value and generating money. That's an ideological view, not necessarily what's good for the population. So they don't always represent our views. They don't always represent our best interests as well. You also have the rule of the charismatic and the manipulation of the truth. Politicians, like lying, becomes second nature. It's like that old joke, how can you tell if a politician's lying? They open their mouths. So this idea that they don't necessarily tell the truth all the time, and because they might have a charismatic or a powerful personality, they're able to manipulate the truth and convince people to vote for them when they're not necessarily the best person for the job, or they don't necessarily have the people's best interests at heart. This whole idea of representative democracy hinges on the idea that the voter has the power, although the voter can be manipulated through charisma. They also, in practice, do not reflect demographics. So if we look at our population, it's massively unrepresentative, which is a big problem. The fact that our parliament is still only 35% women, despite the fact that women are obviously about 51% of the population, not to mention the underrepresentation of people who are BME as well, so massive problems with reflecting demographics. I think more so even in social class too, the fact that so many of our parliament has gone to private school when most of the population has not, that there are most of the parliament actually are landlords, when obviously, especially in the younger demographics, people aren't landlords, or don't even own property. So when it comes to things like trying to create rental rights, that's going to be in the opposite interests of our politicians. Therefore, they're going to not legislate to protect renters because they are renting their properties. They also can yield to controversial opinions to get elected. So this is a quote from historian Peter Fryer when he was talking about the Commonwealth Immigrants Act. And essentially what tends to happen is you often get people having controversial views, which is why it's a positive that we don't have direct democracy, right? Because sometimes those controversial views can lead to things like people wanting to bring back the death penalty, people wanting to send immigrants back to where they came from, as they say. And these are obviously problematic. The death penalty is obviously a massively immoral thing. And also this idea of sending immigrants home is really bad for our economy, because as our population is aging, we need more young people to come and work. As we're not having people in Britain not having as many children, we need immigrants to fill that gap, right? So that's in terms of an economic argument. I know there's a whole other argument for why immigration is a good thing. So what actually tends to happen is, because people are so anti-immigrant, politicians are fearful that they'll lose their vote. So because of that, they tend to side with more controversial views, such as we saw in the 1960s in Britain when the racist tail wagged the parliamentary dog. So you had people from the Caribbean in Britain being massively victimised in society, being persecuted in society, being victims of racial abuse on a daily basis. You had threats and violence against their life. You had Notting Hill race riots, and all of these different moments when black people in Britain were being persecuted. And yet the government's response to this was to stop black Commonwealth immigration coming into the UK. Parliament didn't make the right decision. They made the decision to protect the interests of racism rather than to protect the interests of the victims of racism. You also have the majoritarian electoral system not allowing for pluralism. So we have first past the post in the UK. The problem with first past the post is it just guarantees the big parties constantly getting re-elected and having a higher seat share despite not having an equal distribution of votes. One of the problems in our system, in terms of our democracy being unhealthy, is that the UK is experiencing in some ways a participation crisis. So these are the methods of participation then. So voting is a method of participation. It's the most obvious one. Joining a party, campaigning, organising a petition, going on a demonstration, strikes, writing a letter, and standing for public office. So these things have all experienced some moment when they are in decline. Voting has fallen drastically since 1979. You've been experiencing a steady decline in turnout in general elections, although this has increased in the last two. You had 76% turned out in 1979, and then in 2001 that dropped down to 59%. And there's a variety of reasons for this, which are quite dangerous for a healthy democracy. The fact that a government came in 2001 with 59% is quite scary. It's a very low turnout. That election can be explained by people being apathetic rather than apathetic, because they kind of liked Tony Blair's policies but didn't want to vote for Labour. But also, I think since Tony Blair's government, we're seeing a massive rise in anti-politics. So people just do not trust politicians anymore, and because they don't trust them, they're disaffected and don't follow the system anymore. This was especially seen with the expenses scandal, where politicians were abusing expenses, buying themselves moats and all sorts of crazy things. Also, the fact that there is this turning away from party politics as well, which means that less people are joining parties too. So yeah, we've got a steady decline in voter turnout, although maybe this will be on the rise. But as people feel that politicians just represent an establishment, I think we're going to see a continued rise in anti-politics, which is bad for democracy. So you've got decline of party membership. You've also got the end of this idea of corporatism, which is that so corpus, the human body, that each part of society is a element of a human body, and this is starting to change as society differs, and we're moving away from this idea of a common interest in society. However, it's not all bad, right? So there are other forms of participation. So, for example, petitions have gone up. There are now more political parties. So, in the way that people didn't feel they were representative by the big two, more parties have come and risen. So, as you know, not necessarily a good thing, but UKIP has risen, the Brexit Party. But also you've got a rise of Green Party, which has become more important. But also as Labour has adjusted its policies, it seems to be catching more eyes and getting more young people interested in politics as well. You also have other types of participation, such as pressure groups, which are becoming more popular again. You can see this with Extinction Rebellion, which we'll talk about more in the next session. Social campaigns, especially with things like Facebook and Twitter, being able to just organise people and create more awareness on issues, like the BDS campaign, so boycotts, disinvestment and sanctions against the legally occupied parts of Israel, and people are becoming more involved in those sorts of things. Also, as you've seen, there's definitely been an increase in demonstrations. I don't remember many demonstrations when I was younger, except for the Iraq War ones, but now we're seeing regular protests and people being dissatisfied with politicians and going out and protesting against them. So what I want you to think about then is, does the UK have a democratic deficit? I've given you a copy of this table here that says the democratic criteria. And what I want us to think about is, what is the democratic criteria? And you can see I've laid it out in that table. So is the system democratic? Okay, and I've put how that can be democratic here on that graph there. So another part of democracy is power distributed in society? Is it widely distributed? So pluralism instead of elitism. So do multiple people have a voice, or is it just one group of people? Is information free and available to all? And is there a widespread participation in political activity? So all of these are the criteria for a healthy democracy. And what I want you to do is think, okay, so where does the UK meet this? So in terms of freedom to form legal associations, it is not illegal to join a trade union, for example. Although in terms of failure to meet, the UK government is not doing enough for companies which are trying to discourage this. For example, Asda does not let you join a trade union. And then you've got essentially an overall judgment there. So you can use this little continuum here to do that. So you can say, okay, so freedom to form legal associations, pretty healthy, I'll give that 6. This, and you're going to justify where you've put it in that little section. So it's just a way to get you to think a bit more about criteria and analysis and evaluation as well. The last thing I want us to think about then is things like reforming the UK democracy then. So if participation is a problem in our country, then how do we resolve that? So one of the suggestions is about compulsory voting. So if voter turnout is steadily decreasing, should we create more legislation to enforce people to vote, such as making it compulsory? So we know that this happens in Australia, where if you do not vote, you get a fine. Positives to that, yeah, it can create greater legitimacy because it means that the entire country has voted for this individual or these individuals. It is also a civic duty. It's something that we should be doing, voting. So if it's compulsory, then it means that schools have to do a better job of teaching politics, society has to do a better job of informing voters and so forth, and it would improve people talking about politics as well because they're being forced to engage in it. However, what this can do though is it means that people aren't going to be serious voting often, which is quite bad. So they might just go there and just pick anyone just for the fun of it, which isn't obviously a good thing. It's also a violation of freedom. What if you want to just boycott voting because you disagree with democracy? That's a bit unfair as well. And also you have people who might not understand politics properly going and voting as well. So in terms of another thing to improve the UK's democracy and reform it, it could be done through the franchise. One of the things that we're supposed to look at is how has the franchise been extended in the UK. So you can see here there's this timeline, and I would recommend maybe screenshotting it and annotating it on your notes and just thinking, why are each of these developments important? And yeah, so the one to really focus on, I think, is the suffragettes movement. So you have the women had the right to vote, or kind of, most women some women earned the right to vote in 1918s. Women obviously earned the right to vote through a massive campaign of the suffragettes and the suffragists. And one thing that's quite significant about that is a lot of people have learnt from how those women got the right to vote and adopted those principles in pressure groups today. What more needs to be done for the suffrage movement? And I think you should all recognise the right to vote for 16-year-olds. So I think this is quite a clever protest. So the fact that they've used all the key landmarks for extending the franchise and saying votes for 16 is that final part of that. Should 16 and 17-year-olds have the right to vote? Should the franchise be extended? So it's important to understand the arguments for and against that. In terms of the arguments against it, what do they actually know? Do they actually even care about politics? So 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds, obviously you guys are just too young to be rational. You just don't understand society. You're just young, you're emotional, you have all these hormones. There is no way you can make a rational decision on who to vote for in politics. It's also far too complex for 16-year-olds. There is no way that 16 and 17-year-olds could have any understanding about politics. You don't understand what first past the post is. You don't understand what an MP is or what a politician is or what a politician does. So it's just too complicated for young minds. There's no way you can get your head around this. Also, you have no right to vote because you don't pay tax, or very few of you do. So you have a lower stake in society. So because you don't pay tax, because you don't have a stake in society, there is no way that you should be able to vote because, ultimately what politicians decide doesn't really affect you because you don't pay tax. Obviously, that's a load of rubbish, right? So if we're thinking about it, yes, you do have a stake in society. Whatever is being decided by politicians definitely affects you. For example, politicians voted to raise tuition fees. That's definitely something that affects you. A government decided to remove maintenance grants for university students. That definitely affects you. They decided to remove the education maintenance allowance, which was the £30 a week that people used to get. That definitely affected you because you would be getting that now in school. In terms of changing the exam boards, that 100% affected you because you had to do the new GCSEs. You also had to do the A-levels, which are now linear rather than modular. So yes, you are definitely affected by this. Also, not even just in terms of your education, but environmentally as well. So the lack of good environmental politics influences your lives as well. There's also this argument here that, as a 16-year-old you can join the army, although you can't fight in it, but you can join it. You can not vote, but yeah, so you can drink alcohol, although that is with your parents though, and you can work as well. So your voices are equally important. So young people today are also so much better informed about politics than they were even a generation ago. And that's because you have the wide access to it through social media. You're also, I think, a lot more politically engaged than my generation, the one before you, was. So that's also a massive plus because you care about politics, you know what you're talking about. Voter turnout is beginning to increase with the young demographic anyway, so it seems only fair to include the younger generation in that too. You have been heavily impacted by government decision, but also I think this is a crucial point, and this was why David Runkman argued for the votes for 7-year-olds actually. And age is now the most important factor in voting behaviour. So age decides whether you vote Conservative, whether you vote Labour. However, the young demographic, so under 30s, is massively disadvantaged here because 18 to 30 isn't that much of the population. The biggest population will be sort of 35 to 80 or whatever. And they obviously all are more likely to vote for Conservative. So there is a massive imbalance of the older demographic as there's not as many young people as there are for old people. So in order to make society more fair, you would need to include younger people in the franchise in order to have a more equal and balanced society.